Hello and welcome back to the Hindustan Times podcast. I'm your host, Shashank Mattoo, reporting to you from Washington, D.C. Over the last week, all anyone has wanted to talk about is the American intervention in Venezuela. What the Trump administration's motivations have been, whether that's control over the Venezuelan oil industry, the legality of the intervention into Venezuela, and what it means for the future of the international order and the rules-based system that America claims to uphold, how Russia and China will respond to what has happened in Venezuela over the last week. Joining me to discuss the implications of what the Americans have just done in Venezuela is Matt Duss, who is Executive Vice President at the Center of International Policy, also a former foreign policy advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders. Matt, you have been a prominent critic of the American intervention into Venezuela. Why is that exactly?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for inviting me on, and hello to all the viewers. I think this, a military intervention is a very, very serious undertaking, even in the best of circumstances, even if there is a legal justification, even if it is taken with a country under threat. The United States is not under threat by Venezuela. The President Nicolas Maduro, in my view, clearly was an illegitimate leader, a repressive leader, a corrupt leader, deeply implicated in the drug trade and other crimes. He faced an indictment from a U.S. court. That is not a legal basis for an international invasion of the kind that the Trump administration carried out over the weekend. So I think from that standpoint, also from a constitutional standpoint, the U.S. Constitution empowers Congress, not the president, to authorize the use of military force, because the founders of the United States understood, as I said, that this is one of the most serious things that any country can do, that a president could possibly do, is to use military violence to invade another country and to put Americans in harm's way. That didn't happen here. The president has simply pointed to the indictment in a U.S. court and claimed that this is simply a legal action, a law enforcement action, when it is, I think, to any observer, clearly an act of war. So I think the consequences here for international law are serious, and I think the consequences for U.S. law are very serious.
Right. Matt, could you talk a little bit about the what we're hearing about, the motivations of the administration into going in for this conflict? There's this conversation about, drug networks, cracking down on them. There's this conversation, of course, about this new Trump doctrine, which is, of course, making sure that all of the Western Hemisphere, including Latin America, is really under American control or domination or American leadership, as it were. And regimes like those in Cuba and Venezuela are, of course, have been hostile to American interests for decades. And this is really about getting them out of the way so the Americans can have a new age of domination in the Western Hemisphere. Could you talk a little bit about that, what the motivations are?
Right. I mean, I think there have been multiple justifications and motivations named and reported, whether it's the immigration problem, so many migrants from Latin America, South America, and elsewhere coming through Latin America up to the United States southern border. That is a major political issue in the United States, as it is in many countries. You have the drug issue, the transit of drugs, from and through Venezuela. You have the possible terrorist connection. You have corruption. You have a number of other issues. Democracy, the fact that Maduro's regime was a very repressive and undemocratic one. But again, I think it's very clear that Trump himself, has from what he said over these past few days, none of that is really what's driving this. What is driving this is U.S. control of Venezuela's considerable oil and natural, and energy resources. And as you said, a general sense that the United States has the right to control the entire Western Hemisphere. We saw this reflected in the national security strategy that was released in early December, where it essentially revived what is called the Monroe Doctrine, named after the American President Monroe, who declared America's essentially protection of the entire Western Hemisphere against European imperialism. But that's often been characterized since then in various ways, that the U.S. has the right to determine outcomes all over the region if we determine it's in our interest. And Trump has really amped that up. He calls it the Monroe Doctrine. But to look at a broader global picture, I think it's pretty consistent with what we've seen of how Trump approaches global affairs, which is that powerful countries have the right to make decisions for their entire neighborhood, whether it's Russia in Europe, whether it's China in Asia and the Pacific, whether it's Israel in the Middle East. It's these countries, by virtue of their military power, their economic power, or other tools of influence, have the right to make these decisions and do what they want, however they define their interests, and less powerful countries just have to deal with it.
Right. Can I ask you a question about, you said something, I think, on X, which I thought was interesting. You said that, this is really the end of the rules-based order. You said that, it started under the Biden administration with what happened in Gaza, and now, of course, what the Trump administration has done in Venezuela. Of course, you also see echoes of this with what China and Russia are also doing. Speak a little bit about that in terms of America being this country that even just a couple of years ago was saying that it fought for the rules-based order, and now this has happened. Talk to us about that.
Right. Yeah. Thanks. I mean, I wouldn't say that it started with the Biden administration. I think it really, in many ways, ended with the Biden administration. I think my comment was that the destruction of the rules-based order has been the work of multiple U.S. administrations. I think we can point to the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 as one of the most devastating blows to the rules-based order, in which the United States, based on false claims, the claims of WMD or whatever claims they offered, also in that time, similar to Venezuela, you had multiple justifications given for why the United States was going to invade a foreign country and remove its leader. But I think that was such an affront to the entire idea of a rules-based order, and we've seen other moves since then. Whether the use of drones to assassinate, accused terrorists throughout the world, rendition, kidnapping, torture. And again, it's not just the United States, but I do think the U.S. policy has been a really important factor here, because as the most powerful country in the world, and one that claims to uphold the rules-based order, the United States, in my view, had a particular responsibility to act within those norms and those laws. And I think the United States has so brazenly violated them over many years that it's led to this point. So, as I said in my comment, yes, the Biden administration, with its policy toward Gaza, where it refused to really constrain Israel from violating a whole set of international laws regarding to killing and maiming and destruction of civilian areas. Trump is basically just here for the funeral.
Can I ask you, what does it do to American standing in the world? You mentioned Iraq, lots of conversation about, how that damaged American standing really for a generation in foreign countries. Now we have what's happened in Gaza, what's happened in Venezuela. What does it do to American standing across the world?
Well, I think American standing, was already in trouble because of Gaza and because of those other policies that I mentioned. But I think what's different about the Trump administration is that he's removed even kind of the rhetorical kind of varnish for what the United States is doing. He is just being explicit that the United States will now determine its interest very selfishly. We will pursue those interests without any constraint, as much as we can, wherever we can, whenever we can. And I think what's interesting about Trump is that he takes a very zero-sum approach. Not only to domestic politics. I mean, we see this in his history as a real estate person. He defines his entire success in terms of I win, you lose. That is how he approaches international affairs. And I think, if we're talking about the rules-based order, the kind of a set of international relationships, trade relationships, institutions that set up and support international law, I think what we saw in the post-World War II order was that at least it was underlaid by a concept of positive sum engagement, the idea that countries can get together and work within a set of institutions that every country can benefit from a global order based on a set of agreed upon rules, even if those rules were often broken, even if they were often bent, even if there was hypocrisy and double standards. There was at least a sense that we are all invested in a positive sum enterprise here in terms of the global system. Trump has really upended that entire concept. But as I said, it is consistent with his approach of kind of great power rule of the world. The great powers get to rule their neighborhoods, and they pursue their interests selfishly wherever they can.
Right. A question about India back, because this has been a constant irritation, I think, for New Delhi, where they look at what's happened in Iraq, they look at what's happened in Venezuela, and they also then have to deal with American administrations that come in and say, also, we would like to talk to you about democracy, human rights, what's happening inside your own country. And I think the Indian national security establishment looks at the Americans and says, look at what you guys have done in Iraq, in Libya, in Gaza, in Venezuela. Are you really going to come here and try to talk to us about what we do in the borders of our own country? Can you please stop lecturing us, right? Will that finally end? Will the Americans and American administrations recognize that something has fundamentally changed that their own behavior has shown that they are no longer custodians of the international order, or will we continue having to see the sort of strange policy where the Americans do what they please in their own hemisphere, but of course in other parts of the world they want to talk to China and to India about democracy and human rights in their own countries?
I really doubt that you're going to see at least this administration talk to China or India or any other country about human rights and democracy. You might have the occasional reference to it, as we've seen from a few members of the administration, like Marco Rubio, who says, eventually we want a democratic transition in Venezuela. But Donald Trump clearly does not care about any of that. The people who are really driving this policy do not care about any of that. You can look at Trump's policy, whether it's in the Middle East or whether it's with Russia and Ukraine. It is entirely based on, powerful interests pursuing their goals and less powerful countries having to deal with it. So again, I don't expect that India will have to deal with many challenges from the Trump administration on issues of human rights or democracy. Now, I think the question is the next president, if it's a Democrat or a different kind of Republican, does that change? I mean, my own view as a progressive Democrat is that I believe the United States, the people of the United States, do have an interest in supporting an order in which countries operate according to a set of agreed upon rules and not just might makes right. I believe that is a safer world. I think that's a more prosperous world. But clearly, if the United States is going to try and begin prioritizing issues of human rights and democracy, we have a lot of work to do to rebuild any credibility on those issues.
Mhm. Right. And can I ask you about that question of credibility, right? Because I was sitting down with someone who, did work in the Biden administration on these issues and was saying that, look, when we went out and talked to people about the work that we were trying to do on human rights and democracy, people just said, but what are you guys enabling in Gaza? And that was a real credibility problem. Again, Venezuela, you were talking about the legacy of Iraq. How does one even get around to rebuilding that credibility? Is it even possible?
I think it is possible. It will take a lot of work. It will be the work of multiple administrations. But I think the way we start is we, reassess and change our relationships with a number of countries. For example, stop supporting the Israeli occupation of Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. Change policy there. As you noted, that is a glaring double standard in that the entire world can see. Whenever the United States, makes statements or preaches to other countries about human rights, they can always point to that double standard. So what I would like to do is to see the next administration bring U.S. policy in line with its rhetoric about human rights, about international law. But again, that will be the work of many years and multiple administrations if we're even able to do it.
Right. Let me ask you two or three final questions, Matt. One question about how Russia and China are likely to see this. There has been a lot of commentary on the fact that America opposed the invasion of Ukraine on, of course, grounds of its national interest, but also the fact that the sovereignty of Ukraine was being violated. It's also defending Taiwan on the basis of the fact that Taiwan also has the right to defend its own interest and its democracy against a much more powerful China. What does this do to America's position when it comes to Ukraine as well as Taiwan? Because it has just gone and violated Venezuela's sovereignty on grounds of its own national interests, making it not that very different from Russia and China. Speak a little bit about it.
Right. I mean, again, we can there are some differences, I think, but the general point is sound. The United States has clearly violated the sovereignty of Venezuela on a very, very questionable basis that I think no serious international lawyer would take seriously as a justification for this invasion. So the United States already had very weak credibility to oppose what Russia was doing in Ukraine, although I agree, I think it was the right move to support Ukraine's defense. I do think it's the right move, even though, just to clarify, I don't think presidents have said that Russia doesn't have the right to invade Ukraine, or I'm sorry, China doesn't have the right to seize Taiwan. They have said that we support the current status quo and oppose a military solution to this. But still, I think the underlying that is the idea that Taiwan, is independent and that should be protected. But again, the ability to oppose either of those moves is pretty much gone at this point. Again, it's not to say that Russia or China or any country will simply make its own decisions based on what the United States does or does not do or says or does not say. These countries have their interests. They pursue them. Every country around the world does that. But I think what the U.S. has done in Venezuela and previously has really, really weakened the U.S.'s ability to marshal international consensus, to kind of mobilize international coalitions to work together. We already saw this challenge with Ukraine. The United States was able to work with its European allies, but getting support beyond just the kind of North Atlantic region for what the U.S. was trying to do in Ukraine was very, very tough, precisely because of the hypocrisy that you pointed to, and that problem will be even worse now.
Right. Could I ask you one or two final questions? One being on what we've seen with Venezuela is that, of course, it is a fragile country in terms of its politics. There's conversations about paramilitary groups being there. The fact is that the Americans may have removed President Maduro, but the fact is that the broader ecosystem and the military, as well as the other groups that pose a threat to American interests, as President Trump perceived them, are still in power in Venezuela. So the question is, does this become this sort of quagmire that continues to drag down American resources, American attention, perhaps even American military boots on the ground, becoming sort of another Iraq or an Afghanistan for the Americans that they have to deal with, that continues to suck dry their resources?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to say, although I think one thing that is clear that even though Donald Trump is certainly not anti-war, he is anti-long war. We've seen him. He is certainly not afraid to use military force, as we see in Venezuela, as we saw in Iran last year. As we've seen, I think he's carried out some 7 at least military interventions since becoming president again. And if we look back to his first term, clearly he was not unwilling to use military force there either. But he is very wary of these long-term interventions. I think he is very cautious about putting U.S. boots on the ground because I think he understands that that is what really generates domestic political backlash. Is once American troops start coming home in coffins, that is a real political cost. So I think he imagines he can manage this situation without imposing many American troops on the ground. And let's also understand, this was not a kind of technical regime change. This was basically just a regime decapitation. You removed the top leader and left his vice president in charge now. So the question is whether Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president, now the acting president of Venezuela, will be able to consolidate power and act in a way that is pleasing to Donald Trump. That is really what we're talking about here. Donald Trump has essentially claimed ownership of Venezuela to say that we're going to get the oil. But he has left the Maduro regime minus Maduro in place to manage affairs in Venezuela to do that.
Right. And just a final question about what really motivates Donald Trump? Because the question is that on the same day that, the Venezuela intervention happened, or at least in the same week, we've also seen Donald Trump withdraw from 66 international organizations. There seems to be this question about he's happy to launch military strikes against Iran. He's happy to launch strikes against ISIS groups in Nigeria. He's happy to conduct, as you say, regime decapitation in Venezuela, but he doesn't want to be part of international organizations. And he seems to feel like this entire world order is a burden on America's shoulders. But also he pursues a fairly imperial policy with Venezuela and other countries of the world. What is the Trump doctrine? What animates the Trump administration? Because it seems like there are these contradictory impulses that you don't understand fully.
Yeah, I mean, I would caution against trying to kind of find a coherent through line in Donald Trump's ideology. The one thing that Donald Trump is interested in is Donald Trump. I mean, what is good for Donald Trump politically? What is good for Donald Trump financially? That is really the only thing that really explains his action. But I do think what we see is a very, very, it's not just a reversion to the pre-World War II. I mean, this is a very old kind of 1890s approach to U.S. foreign policy where the U.S. And frankly, all the older empires simply use their military power, their economic power to extract tribute, to extract wealth, to extract concessions from other less powerful countries, and just do whatever it wants. So Donald Trump believes that by virtue of the U.S.'s power, it has the right to tell other countries, especially in the Western Hemisphere, but elsewhere around the world, how to manage their affairs. And the way to manage their affairs is to give tribute to the United States and to give tribute to the Donald Trump organization.
Mm-hmm. Right. And there you have it, Venezuela, an intervention of dubious legality, but also raising serious questions about America's moral standing in the world, its ability to stand up to Russia and China, and also how it will be seen in India and also abroad in the years to come. Matt Duss, thank you so much for joining us here on the HD podcast to talk about Venezuela and to share your insights.
Thank you. My pleasure.